休息完啦。我哋而家會去。
We now enter the fourth part on utilities. Part 4. We have to refer you back to page 6. I would like to conclude by 6:30, and if not, we can extend a little bit. Yes, I also like to conclude part 4. In figure 1, page 6, utilities are another major pollutant. Sulfur dioxide from coal-fired generators, and they also emit a lot of particulates. Then moving to page 43, I'd like to ask what are the 3 memorandums? Are they subsidiary legislation? Is it a technical agreement? So what are these 3 memorandums? This is subsidiary legislation endorsed by LegCo. Referring to the 3 memorandum on page 44, there are standards on emissions. We have the memorandums running from 2010 to 2017. Nitrous oxides. In the 2007 consultancy review, the limit was 17,000 tons, but in the 3rd technical memorandum from 2017, the emission level is 25,950 tons, which is even higher than the 2007 consultant review. So could they explain why is the nitrous oxide emission level so high in 2017? In the 2007 consultant review, the consultant proposed a conceptual emission control regime. They assume that with the installation of filters, they would reduce the nitrous oxide emission to 17,375 tons. But in a utility, retrofitting in existing utilities, there are a lot of restrictions. But the 07 consultant, they didn't make detailed calculations for extra facilities. Later on, we looked at whether there was further room for emission reduction, and we see in nitrous oxide, if we are to cap it at 17,000 tons, there is no room for such retrofitting facility. But according to the law, we require the utilities to consider feasible measures. So in the second and third memorandum, we are still reducing the nitrous oxide emissions. And allow me to explain why we can reduce the emissions from 42,000 tons to 25,000 tons. It's because the utilities are using the natural gas, and when they comply with the first technical memorandum, they have added desulfuring, nitrous oxide facilities. So besides using natural gas turbines, they are also using the state-of-the-art filters, and we can reach the levels stipulated in the second technical memorandum. And if they maintain the efficiency of these filters and use low-emitting coal, so low-polluting coal allows the utilities to reduce sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxide as well. Thank you. If these measures, if these emission levels if the emission levels increase, are there any fines? According to the air pollution control regulations, if the utility contravenes the emission cap, there is a fine. For first infringement, each excessive ton will incur a fine of 30,000. For the second occasion, there is a fine of $60,000 per ton, and also an imprisonment of 6 months. So when you monitor these emission levels, do you do so at the utility, or what methods do you use to monitor? In the chimney of the utility, we have a monitoring equipment, and these figures will be communicated to the environmental department through the telephone lines. So in Table 9, emissions from local power plants. So air quality is much better when we use natural gas. The Hong Kong utilities only provide some 77% of electrical power. Some 23% comes from the mainland nuclear facilities. But the 77% local capacity, coal makes up some 71%. So since we have 23% being nuclear, and we have dozens of operating nuclear plants surrounding us, so one nuclear incident and two doesn't make a difference. So why don't we increase the nuclear portfolio? Is that a policy issue? Well, if you can't answer us now, you can respond in the environmental affairs panel. We have an agreement to purchase nuclear power. Our nuclear power comes from Daya Bay. They provide some 70% of their output to Hong Kong. So if we want to purchase more, it's not that easy. We need to go through different negotiations, so we don't need to go through that. I know that natural gas is in tight supply. CLP, they have a gas source in South China Sea, but it will expire in the next 2 or 3 years. So they'll need to import natural gas from the west. So if our utilities increase the use of natural gas, they have to increase the proportion of natural gas in order to comply with the memorandum. So it will have an impact on tariffs. So if you say that if we want clean air, then we'll have to pay higher electricity tariffs. So how do we strike a balance? This is a good question, but the officials can answer, but when they respond, it involves a policy issue. So it's up to you to respond. This is also a policy issue. I'm just reminding the Secretary. I don't want to cross our boundary and step into Environmental Affairs Panel ambit. Well, we need to balance 4 areas: safety, stability, reasonable price, and environmental concern. So that is the long-standing policy. The long-standing energy policy is based on 4 considerations: safety, stability, reasonable price, and environmental friendliness. So we have wide considerations regarding our energy portfolio. In the coming future, we'll also review this policy. I'm also aware the CLP, I've met with the CLP regarding the fuel mix. So if you use different grades of coal, there are different pollution outcomes. So is there any stipulation on what grade of coal that is used? We regulate the sulfur content and ash content. Cannot be more than 1% sulfur, and cannot be more than 15% ash. So is that the highest standards? Well, of course, natural gas would be most popular in terms of environmental standards, but it's very costly. But the coal, is that the highest grade coal that is used? The standards we're using now are international low sulfur coal. If other countries are still using coal-fired generators, what's the highest standard? I want the specific answer. in other countries, we regulate the emission standards. There is a lot of flexibility in terms of coal. The utilities the coal they are using is less polluting than the standard we've set. So that means you can set even tighter standards. Well, that's not exactly the case. We allow the utilities some headroom because they make different purchases throughout the year, but we give them a cap. Could you explain it to us? There is a range there are different grades of coal that will emit a range of emissions. So perhaps they can provide some written information and regarding what kind of coal is being used in Hong Kong. So could you provide a written response? Okay. I'd like to add that Hong Kong doesn't have its own coal. Some countries use coal is because they have coal mines. Hong Kong has to source its coal from different regions, and different regions will have different characteristics. In the past, CLP, Hong Kong Electric, they are using low sulfur, and it's available from Indonesia. Only Indonesia has these low sulfur coal. And we're assuming that utilities will be needing more low sulfur coal. So could you provide a document for us? Kenneth? I don't have any follow-up questions. Kam-sing? I'd like to ask in table 8, the 2007 consultant review, and then there's the 2010, 2015, 2017 technical memorandum. So from 07 till 2017, the particulate levels are more or less the same. So I'd like to ask, when the policy was set by 2017, it seems that technologically there would be a big difference. So should there be standards for 2017?
數據嚟嘅咧？
No, I am a bit concerned. Now, if we catch up, we would already be lagging behind. By how much, I don't know. Mr. Moore, the first question first. Thank you, Chairman. Now, in 2007, the consultant review at the time, it's a review of the air quality objective. At the time, the consultant suggested a new set of AQOs and also measures to improve air quality. Now, Table 8, under Table 8, the consultant raised some conceptual proposals to reduce emissions at the power plants to 17,375 tons. Now, as I said earlier, at the time the consultant did the review, it didn't carefully study whether the proposals were achievable in practical terms, because we have some power plants that are already built. At the same time, in 2010, there was large-scale retrofitting for existing power generation units for emission reduction. Now, after the 2007 consultancy review, we did some careful studies now on the reduction of NOx, whether they can be retrofitted further facilities to achieve the conceptual target of the consultant. Now, the conclusion was that there were certain spatial limitations. So I explained that under the first, second, and third technical memoranda, we did try to see what can be done that's feasible under current technology for emission reduction. You have explained that already clearly. So by the third memorandum, what's feasible has been reduced to 25,950 tons. Now, the technical memorandum requires that every 2 years we review the memorandum itself. So when we review, we look at the current technology to see whether there is further scope to reduce emissions. Now, for nitrous oxide, for NOx, we will certainly try to see whether we can reduce that further. Now, I understand the 2007 consultancy study. Now, you said there is a 49% difference when you compare to 25950 to 17375, and same for RSP. Now, is the figure in the 2007 review still applicable in 2017? Now, will that goal again be inappropriate? Now, your 25,950 is still behind 3375, and so can you speak in the light of current scientific development? Now, as mentioned earlier, we review every 2 years where practicable. If we can reduce the emission allowance, we would certainly do it. Now, looking at Table 8, the latest 3 technical memoranda, you can see that we have been tightening the allowances. Now, as for Mr. Ng Leung Sing's concern, why NOx in 2007 study was very ambitious and yet we couldn't achieve it. Now, actually, for the consultancy report in 2007, it was in response to the new AQOs, and then in 2007 there was a public consultation document. This is what I am holding, and in Appendix E of that report, according to the consultancy study, after the emission reduction arrangements, there would be certain reductions of pollutants. Now, as for power generation, in Note 2, it said that new emission reduction measures, facilities, including some desulfurization facilities, changing technology. Now, the financial feasibility has not been established. There has to be further study in conjunction with the power companies. So for 1732375, that's a very rough estimate. Now, if there are no limitations, the power units can achieve that, but these were existing power units which have operated for years, so there were certain spatial constraints. So the optimistic estimate by the consultant could not be reached. Andrew, can you give us a copy? No thing. Now, looking at the figures, the third technical memorandum says that we can achieve 25950 by 2017. Now, that's 49% more than 17375, as mentioned in paragraph 4.6. Now, I don't quite understand. Why is it that for RSP we can achieve the target? We move from 737 to 750. Now, RSP is most damaging to health. Now, if 737 will do the least harm to human health, now, why is it that there's such a big difference between 25950 and 17375? How can the public become more confident? What can you do? Now, for NOx, for SO2 and the RSP, for the power generation plants, if we are to achieve the standards agreed with Guangdong Province, the 2010 standards, some desulfurization equipment was retrofitted, and that effectively reduced SO2 and RSP emission. But as for NOx, to achieve the target, they need to retrofit some equipment like for burning nitrous oxides, and some such equipment was installed to reach the 2010 standards reached with the Guangdong government. The consultants now, in estimating the emission reduction targets, they assumed that there would be new equipment which would reduce NOx by a very large percentage, but in reality, these were not new power plants. There was limited space. They can only install facilities within pipes, and the reduction can be only 51%. So that's why there's a difference. Now, as for other pollutants, the reduction could reach our target. Moreover, for the second and third technical memorandum, we require them to use more natural gas so that it reduces SO2 and RSP further. Now you're able to react positively on the fuel mix for the long term, as raised by the Director of Audit's report. And you said that SO2 and RSP could be reduced. However, the chance for reducing NOx is still far from the goal outline. So we like to understand more. The EPD explained that this was mainly due to the coal-fired plants have a high emission of NOx, and other toxic substances would also be emitted. So I like to look at this from the point of view of cost effectiveness. Now, if you are slow in the improvement, there is still 25,950 tons. Now, the goal of the 2007 study might be effective in 2017, then you should look into it again. Can you reduce the pollutants further, and do you need to announce the actual level? Because these are toxic substances, the public will be scared. How toxic would they be? Can you explain, Mr. Pang? Let me explain further about nitrous oxides. Now, NOx is more difficult to reduce than the other pollutants because it's unlike the sulfur content being high in coal, etc. Now, under high temperature, there is burning of oxygen and nitrous oxide is formed. So we can't just use low sulfur coal or low ash content coal or to fit something onto the vehicle exhaust. It's not like those cases which can be effective unless we have a high efficiency facility, specialized facility. And as explained earlier, this is not possible in the existing spatial setup. Now, the power plants also emit other pollutants, as Mr. Mentioned. Now, certain substances appear in the RSPs. So when we reduce the RSPs, we reduce these toxic pollutants too. Now, at the end of last year, at the power plants, we did some tests. Now, for those harmful substances, compared to the American standards, it's 9.1 micrograms for each unit of electricity, and we have a quite a bit lower emission by comparison. Alan? Are there other speakers who want to speak? If not, I draw the line here. Alan? Now, in part 4, I think the main focus should be on use of natural gas to replace coal for power generation. Now, I'd like to ask, what policy is the government adopting to achieve this objective at an early date? Because if you look at the time required right now, it's quite long. As members asked, if you look at the first technical memorandum and all the way to the third memorandum, if you are worried about NOx, actually we see that there's still a long way to go before we can reach the 17375 tons proposed in 2007. Now, by 2017, it's going to be 25,950, and as Mr. Leung Sing said, then we will forever be short of reaching that goal. So can the administration tell us how you can replace coal with natural gas in an early date? You'd like to ask the Secretary? Yes, Chairman, we have different ways to achieve our AQOs. Now, there are 3 pollution sources: power plants, ships, and motor vehicles. Now, the 2007 consultancy review is based on certain assumptions that are on a ballpark basis, but that's not most important. The important thing is that by 2017 or 2019, we reduce emission at all 3 sources, and we achieve the overall target. So we've signed the agreement on objectives with Guangdong Province. So outside the power plants, we also work on the vehicles, motor vehicles and ships, so that we can achieve the AQOs. Now that's our understanding. Now at the time, the review was based on certain assumptions, and those assumptions leave space for adjustment. So overall, at an appropriate time, we will achieve the AQOs. Alan? Now, I'd like to ask, now, you heard from the 2 power companies that they want to raise the tariffs, and next year the profit agreement would be reviewed, and has the government considered as a possibility that the emission reduction would be a requirement in some way, so that natural gas would replace coal? Now, in the profit control agreement, there would be incentive or certain sanction or penalty. Now, if you exceed 17375 by a certain amount, then you will have to pay a certain amount. Now, Chairman, if we look forward from the technical memoranda, now first we can review the agreement with the 2 power companies, and we can review next year our fuel mix. Now, natural gas, that is the mix between natural gas, coal, and nuclear, and we will inform the public about the price comparison and so on.
Christine.
So we'll conduct a review in a number of respects. Christine, you'd like to supplement? Yes, slightly. On energy, what will we do in future? First of all, number 3, by 2017, we should require the 2 power companies to use more natural gas. Otherwise, they can't attain the objective set in TM3. Well, even before the interim review and the overall review, we have to attain these targets. But when it comes to a full review, more complicated discussions will be involved. Well, the 2 power companies will have to use more natural gas and greatly reduce coal. As mentioned just now, over 70% of local electricity are coal-generated. So to greatly reduce the use of coal, a lot of plants will have to be replaced. So it's not so simple as to ask the power companies to use more natural gas. So in this committee, it's not too appropriate to discuss our future energy policy. So I ask the committee for more room for discussion on other occasions. I'd like to take this opportunity to seek a clarification. Just now, the Secretary for the Environment gave us the impression that vehicles, marine vessels, etc., are all polluting sources apart from power companies. So apparently, he would like to be more lenient on the two power companies. But it seems that the Undersecretary was clarifying this. Can we put on record that the Bureau indicated to this committee today that power companies as polluting sources would adopt positive measures to reduce, as far as possible, the polluting sources, that is, the pollutants. Secretary, would you like to confirm that point, or would you like to make some remarks? Well, basically, for all pollutants, when practicable and possible, we would like to reduce the level of pollution as far as possible. So you agree? Finally, Paul, very short, Mr. Chairman. Just now, when Mr. Wong mentioned Table 8, and in his reply to Mr. Alan Leung's question, the Secretary seemed to be giving us the impression that he would like to top up the measures targeting power companies by working on marine vessels and vehicles. But here, Table 8 is about emission allowances for local power plants, not for other polluting industries. Can the Secretary further clarify? Mr. Leung asked about the target set for 2007 and the target set for 2017. It seems that we won't be able to attain the targets for NOx. Was the Secretary misleading us? Anissa? Mr. Chairman, I'd like to offer two pieces of supplementary information. For the 2015 and 2017 TMs, insofar as emission control, our targets are based on the actual situation of the power plants, which are to introduce as far as possible emission reduction measures to reduce emission. For 2017, the requirements of the TM are on the basis of coal and gas in the ratio of 50 to 50. At the moment, coal to gas is in the ratio of 7 to 3. And when the consultancy study was conducted, the consultant was only using the information available to him then. So for NOx, the recommended emission was different from our targets. The consultancy report targeted the new 2015 AQOs, which are not our ultimate objectives. That's only an interim set of objectives. After introducing the new AQIs, or AQOs, we're to conduct interim reviews once every 5 years, be it for vehicles, marine vessels, or power plants. For power plants, how are we going to improve the emission performance of them? As the Secretary mentioned, in future, fuel mix would be a very important factor. In fact, at the moment, for each power plant, after 1997, we already had a policy to replace coal-fired plants, and the new plants cannot use coal anymore. They must use natural gas. Of course, some parties mention nuclear energy as well as other types of energy. Anyway, we have eliminated the retention of coal. So we'll strive to reduce the pollutants from power plants. And of course, we should also manage demands and enhance the efficiency of our fuel and energy. Paul asked whether the Secretary was only referring to power plants. That's the question of Paul. Mr. Ng Leung-sing asked about Table 8, how you would attain the targets in 2017. You said that you could rely on other methods, but if you can't attain the targets in Table 8, how can you attain other targets? Table 8 is only on power plants, so I just want to clarify that the Secretary was not misleading us. Paul, the Permanent Secretary mentioned the retirement of existing plants. At the moment, our power plants lack space for emission reduction facilities. Sorry, the speaker is not coming through. Well, each unit has a lifespan. We regularly discuss with the two power companies in assisting them to make a decision on when their generators would be replaced. This is an annual exercise. Paul, any more? Well, I don't want to create difficulties for the Permanent Secretary, who may have to go back and dig up figures. For the consultancy report, it does not cover pollution by coal gas when compared with electricity and the other types of energy. Sorry, the speaker is not coming through. Coal gas is clean in generating fuel. Now they've switched to natural gas. Basically, they're using NOx. Selective catalytic converters have been used to reduce NOx. Well, this is just a question in passing. If there's no more question, Kenneth, can we move on to part 4? Yes, Mr. Chairman, it's part 5. Part 5. Emission control of non-road mobile machinery. Well, if we look at the overall picture, we'll see that the pollution level by non-road mobile machinery is not the most serious when compared with the other 3 pollutants. Now, for non-road mobile machinery, including bulldozers and machinery used by the catering business, may I refer you to paragraph 5.5. The audit said that the legislative procedures could be completed by May next year. Can the committee be updated with the latest progress? We're now asking the DOJ to draft the bill for us. Can you give us a rough timetable? When are you going to go to the panel when will the first and second readings take place? Just give us a rough timetable. Mr. Pang? We hope that in the first half of next year, maybe around April to May, we'll be able to do so. May I refer you to paragraph 5.3 of the audit report. There it is said that there were 13,500 units of NRMM, that is non-road mobile machinery, operating in Hong Kong. Among those units, how many are in the direct control of government departments? Do you have the figure? We don't have the figure, Chairman. Perhaps you do not know the distribution of those machinery either. In paragraph 5.5, you say that you legislate to regulate the sale, lease, or supply of NRMM units, either new or second-hand. If you don't have these statistics, in what way can you regulate second-hand units? Mr. Chairman, when a piece of new legislation is implemented, existing units, or rather new units will have, or existing units will have to be registered with us, and we'll give them an exemption label. After the enactment of the bill, the label has to be attached to the unit before it can be used. So by this labeling system, we'll be able to regulate the existing units. That means the coverage of the bill will be that for existing machinery, no matter how polluting they are, you exempt them. And the new law will only apply to new units. Is that what you meant? Mr. Chairman, the regulation being drafted at the moment will regulate newly imported units that are used in Hong Kong. That is, the new units will have to attain international standards. Well, for new units, they can attain American or EU standards. But what about existing units? You won't be able to regulate them. So you're putting the cart in front of the horse. I understand the honourable member's point, but the amendment bill is first to regulate newly imported machinery from American and European jurisdictions, so as to make sure that they satisfy the new emission standards. For the existing machinery, we try to contain the problem by a labeling system first. We don't want to allow second-hand units to raise the emission by NRMM. So we'd like to handle new machinery first. At present, there are 100 existing units. On the average, they've been in use for 8 years. In paragraph 5.3 of the audit report is mentioned that the average service life of these machinery is 14 years. So after we've set the standard for newly imported machinery, then within a period of time, the existing units will be eliminated naturally. Well, you have to wait for 6 years for existing units to be eliminated. That's totally unacceptable. Instead of using a labeling system, if you spot a really poor machinery, you should say that it is substandard. Well, the secretary was telling us that by putting a label on the machinery can be allowed. So instead of having somebody to stick a label onto each and every unit, you should eliminate the really poor performing machinery. If a machinery is really too poor, you should not give him or give it a label. I understand the honourable member's concern. At present, NRMM does not have an emission standard, but as pointed out in paragraph 5.4 of the audit report, we do want to reduce the emission level to the minimum, and they must use ULSD, ultra-low sulfur diesel, in order to reduce as far as possible the emission level. For existing NRMM, we don't yet have a regulatory regime, but if a unit is emitting dark smoke under the air pollution ordinance, our colleagues can make use of the Ringelmann chart to enforce the law. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to follow up on paragraph 5.4. You say that the existing NRMM has to use ULSD, that is 0.005%. Can you tell us more about law enforcement? Our colleagues do enforce the law in terms of industrial fuel. They do collect fuel samples. If irregularities are detected, we'll enforce the law. Mr. Chairman, one more question. You say that you enforce the law in respect to the quality of industrial fuel. You rely on the industries themselves, or you send your staff members along to take fuel samples? Mr. Mok, our colleagues do take sample fuel from, say, construction sites. If the fuel is substandard, we'll enforce the law. Well, Mr. Chairman, I'll pass the floor to other colleagues first. Well, just now the follow-up question was very good. Earlier, Mr. Leung mentioned using money to buy public health. Government contracts, well, we have very expensive government contracts. For those contracts, do you specify in the tendering documents that old and seriously polluting machinery should not be used so as to eliminate the pollution problem? Thank you, Chairman. In fact, in paragraph 5.12 of the audit report, the Director of Audit does recommend that the government should take the lead to include measures in works contracts to ensure that NRMM units meet specified environmental standards. We agree to that recommendation. We've already started to consult the industry. The Hong Kong Construction Association and other members of the industry have met with us. Representatives of chambers of commerce and trade associations that met with us told us that they supported the new standards. But of course, we have to consider a number of factors. For example, NRMM units on work sites. If new units are to be imported, how much time do we need? What about the price of the new units? And what about the service life of these units?
So we also have to consider the impact on the engineering works costs, and we also have to consider whether it will lead to a heavy economic burden on the contractors. So we'll consider all these. For example, overall speaking, the EPD The average life expectancy for these machines are 8 years, but it can be used 14 years. So if we implement this too aggressively, then suppliers who rent these to contractors, if they are to be implemented immediately to comply with the new legislation, then it would lead to a loss in their initial investment. We also consider large equipment. These are very expensive. They could exceed 10 million. And if they have such a large investment, and when we enforce the contract, we also have to consider these factors. So we will look at the different types of machinery and consider different equipment can be used over different periods of time. So for frequently used machine of low cost, these will have to be replaced earlier and will require the contractor to use machinery that complies with the new legislation. Thank you, Chairman. In paragraph 5.13, the Secretary for Environment responds to the audit report regarding the NRMM. It says that they will draw reference from overseas experience, but they have not determined what would be appropriate in Hong Kong. But Hong Kong is as a city with high population density, so compared to overseas, it would be very different. So by the time they collect the relevant data, it might not be practical. So should we consider that Hong Kong being so densely populated, then when we draft our legislation and so on, I applaud the department in their maintaining the status quo. So I think we need to maintain the status quo. We need to draw reference from overseas, but we still need to adapt to the needs of Hong Kong. So whether we're talking about excavators, trucks, they produce a lot of emissions. So these second-hand NRMMs, you don't have a registry system yet. You lack the inventory data. So I'd like to ask, it might not be second-hand equipment, but it could be very old and obsolete equipment. It could be heavily polluting. So you can have second-hand equipment that has been hardly used, so it's not an issue of whether it's first-hand or second-hand. Mr. Mok? Our report has stated that we will maintain the status quo regarding NRMM. That is, the black smoke cannot exceed certain criteria. But if we want to further regulate, not just black smoke or nuisance, and as a matter of fact, then we need to take reference from overseas experience, such as detection methods and so on. It's not just black smoke, and we will therefore need to keep pace with technological developments. But we agree and understand that Hong Kong is densely populated, so we will take note of that. The second question regarding 5.13b, it responds to 5.11b, where we need to implement the NRMM emission control system as early as possible. So we want to take stock of NRMMs, because this affects how fast we can legislate. So we will accelerate our work to interface with the timely legislation. So we have mandatory inspections for mandatory annual inspections for vehicles over 6 years old. Yes, we will consider that. In NRMMs, there are different types of equipment. Our first step is to implement our proposal, and we would like to look at taking it a step further. The regulation of NRMM they are exempting the old equipment, but in the audit report, whether it's the ACE, we would like the department to regulate existing stock. Chairman, we've heard that they can't regulate vessels, power utilities, NRMMs. So it seems that aside from doing more on vehicles, they seem to be very passive in other polluting sources. It seems that they're powerless in every aspect. In existing stock, whether it's ACE, they focus they have an inspection system. As I said, in our existing legislation, there is regulation on NRMM. If we want to further regulate emissions, then we need to look at overseas experience. And as a matter of fact, there is a wide spectrum of this type of equipment. There isn't a clear methodology to regulate in-use NRMM. We understand that we need to put more effort in this. So first of all, we hope to implement our proposal through legislation, and we're also looking at strengthening the regulation of in-use NRMM. We will keep an eye on technological development, and we will step up inspection. A lot of NRMMs, if you were to regulate them strictly, then a lot of construction sites would come to a halt. Thank you, Chairman. We talked about supply and these NRMM polluting sources might not be large piling equipment. It could be small power generators. Mr. Pang also said they would do random checks. So could they provide some figures and prosecution figures so we can evaluate their work performance? Can you provide some information? The EPD in paragraph 5.3, they have information on these NRMMs. But is there a registration system? We don't have a registration system. But after legislation, they will have to register in order to continue using this equipment. And paragraph 5.7 refers to the consultant review. And where they propose introducing emission control measures for existing NRMM. Well, how would you do this? So, 5.7. Regulation of NRMM. We don't have a system to regulate NRMM emissions. We can only regulate the fuel, the ultra low sulfur, and whether they emit black smoke. If we are to set emission standards, then we need to understand the different models, the different vintages, and whether we can retrofit emissions control systems. It depends on the nature of the equipment. Some equipment might need to be replaced very quickly. So we might have some large equipment, and we have to see whether it's feasible to install or retrofit emission controls. So we need a registration system first, and then we can follow up through these database. So without a database or registration system, you have no idea of what equipment is off the road. But in 5.3, you are aware that there's 13,500 units. Is this just reported and you add the figures? The 13,500. We had appointed a consultant to come up with the figures. While the PAC should record that the Bureau and Department will move towards a registration system for non-road mobile machinery. After registration, they will set emission standards. Can we record it as such? Well, first of all, we need to target the new imports. And the second step would be for in-use NRMM after there is a registration system. We can have, after having a more comprehensive understanding, we can look at further regulation. So if there's a larger group of a certain equipment, then we can target them first, rather than all 13,500 units together. We need to understand the problem first, and we can follow up at a later stage. So perhaps Mr. Lai could provide a timetable or flowchart, what will be done first, second, and so on. That could be quoted in our report. I heard the Permanent Secretary for Development talk about difficulties. In government contracts, award schemes, if you have a new piece of equipment, they can be given extra credit. And it won't have a large impact in the tender system, but adding this element will at least express a sincerity and attitude and direction. So the Development Bureau, have they considered adding this element in public contracts?
Now, as we said earlier, we have to implement the contract requirements. It's not just giving them more points. Now, at a certain time, when we issue the contract, if you want to bid for NRMM, you have to achieve the new standards proposed in the legislation. There would be no alternative. They would be mandatory. Now, we can also have reference to Mr. Leung's suggestion. Well, there must be a time set. Now, if you give them more points, that's also feasible. It just shows your attitude or preference. You want to go to part 6? Yes. Yes, you go to part 6. That's regional emission control, cooperation with Pearl River Delta. Now, I'd like to ask about paragraph 6.3. Now, there was a joint agreement, joint announcement with the Guangdong government in December 2003, and also now we signed an agreement in 2004. Why was it that we used 1997 as a reference basis? Was it that there was high emission in 1997, or was there other reason? Now, for emission reduction target, it took time, now, especially where it concerns Guangdong and Hong Kong. Now, the study started in 1999. At that time, the data on hand, the latest, was the 1997 data. So it's on that basis that the study took 1997 as a reference basis. Now on paragraph 6.7, now in 2002 you determine the target. Now it seems that the target was achieved, and yet you did not upload the details to websites. Is that what's said in paragraph 6.7? In our first chapter, we explained that on the emission checklist of 2010, it took some time because we were doing a major study on ships and also one on vehicle emissions, so we were waiting for the outcome, and then we can see how the 20 targets would be achieved. Now, so in October 2012, we already announced how the targets were reached. So you announced that all the targets were achieved. Yes, we achieved all the emission targets for Hong Kong. Now, the 2002 announcement was the targets were achieved. Now, will you have other plans for your emission targets now? Now, at the end of last month, we reached an agreement with Guangdong provincial government, and the emission reduction arrangement would last till 2020. There would be 2012 targets and 2020 targets. Now, perhaps should I read out the emission reduction targets? You give us a report, please. Thank you. Can I continue? Yes. I'd like to take you 6.11. Now, the University of Hong Kong conducted a study on particle matters, and it's been found that 67% of suspended particulates are non-local still, and the conclusion is that, i.e., it comes from PRD region and beyond. Now, before the HKU study, there was a similar study which reached similar conclusions, and many industrialists tell us that in the past few years in Dongguan and in nearby areas there were a lot less factories. At the same time, the Guangdong government recently introduced a lot of very stringent environmental requirements to restrict emissions from factories. Now, can the administration provide an answer? Now, the HKU study still showed that 67% of suspended particulates still came from sources near Hong Kong. Now, on suspended particulates, the density, now, it's a problem for the entire Pearl River Delta. Now, the HKU, there was also HKUST study that did a study earlier which reached similar conclusions, that is a large portion of our suspended particulates are from non-local sources. Now, apart from university studies, is there other proof? Now, last time when we talked about Chapter 1, we also provided a PowerPoint which showed that at the Tap Moon monitoring station, compared with our general monitoring stations, the RSP concentration, now if you look at the power P, again, you would see that the general monitoring stations concentration of RSP is very similar to that at Tap Moon. Now, Tap Moon is very far from the urban area, so our emission would not affect Tap Moon. So it's the PRD areas that would affect Tap Moon. So it shows indirectly that the university studies in Para 6.11, the HKU and other university in 2005, now it shows that a very large share of our RSM comes from the mainland. Of course, there are emission reduction measures in the mainland which are very stringent. The factories have to move further away. So overall, the RSM concentration is falling. Now, for the PRD as a whole, it's falling. At the same time, we see a drop in RSM too. So it all matches. Kenneth? Now, you are working with the Environmental Protection Department of Guangdong. How are you cooperating? Now, you say 67% is still a large share. Now, have you been working with the Guangdong authorities? Did you ask them to do a little more to improve the air quality of the region? Mr. Mo? Now, we see the importance of regional cooperation for improving air quality. Therefore, when we set the emission reduction targets from 2010 onwards to 2020, we target NOx, SO2, the particulates, and the VOx, volatile organic substances. Now, VOC. Now, for VOC, that has got to do with ozone. SO2 or NOx. Now, they can be transformed into particulates. A large proportion of the particulates were transformed from SO2 and nitrous oxide. Now, and then there are other particulates. So we try to reduce these on a regional basis to reduce the RSP concentration and to improve the ozone situation. Kenneth, I'd like to follow up also on the setting up of the low emission control areas. On para 6.12 in paragraph B, now on ships, now marine vessels, I understand that the low emission control area must requires cooperation with neighboring PRD cities and Macau. Now, what's the progress? And have you encountered difficulties that have to be resolved, and so that the areas, low pollution areas, are still not yet achieved? Mr. CHEUNG? 6.12b, Roman numeral 2, the emission control area. Christine? Now, this refers to emission from marine vessels. Now, we work with Guangdong and Beijing. Now, we engage in discussion, and that started only recently. And it's not just the environmental protection authorities. Those departments in transportation also play an important part. Now, we don't have great difficulty at the moment, but we have started discussing the issue with them. Andrew. Now, let me supplement on the Undersecretary's response. Now, on the setting up of emission control area for ships, now that has to do with the fuel switch on berthing requirement for ocean-going vessels that we talked about earlier on. Now, there are short and long-term measures. Now, on emission control area, the impact is greater, and so is the difficulty compared with fuel switch for ocean-going vessels. Now, as for the latter, there are certain cost and operational problems. Now, if you set up these emission control areas, then before the vessels come into berth, they already have to switch to low sulfur diesel, then the cost concern will be all that much greater. So from our perspective, setting up emission control area is even more challenging than fuel switch upon berthing. So when we talk with Guangdong on these two measures, we tell them that we want to cooperate in the long term on these two approaches. So we try to reach consensus at an early date. And now, whether it's Guangdong province or Beijing, what's their reaction to the first stage of this discussion? Yes, Christine, it's been positive. Beijing officials have been talking to us, and on the emission control area, now actually this is a unique term. Now, if we make them capital letters, then it's what the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, can approve. Now, if we're going to achieve that, it's not just fuel switch upon berthing. There would be a whole series of measures. Now, for such emission control areas in Northern Europe and in North America, they have already put that into practice. Now, if we're going to achieve this in PRD, if we are going to apply for IMO control area, this has to the application has to go through the Beijing government. So you can imagine that it's only in the past few weeks that we started the discussion, so it takes some time. It's been positive, yes. So I have no further questions. Will you take long? Next, Sing, if necessary. You have to allow me to go beyond 6:30 now. So, Chairman, now I'd like the government to clarify on para 6.11. Now, if we're going to target air pollution, we must have specific data and studies. Now, the Audit Commission says that the EPD has to conduct studies on the pollutants in Hong Kong, and you can see that the HKU did these studies twice on the suspended particulates. Now, as for other pollutants such as SO2 and NOx, those studies haven't been done. Now, when we were doing the hearing, the government said that many polluting sources were from outside Hong Kong, and so I'm a bit confused. If we haven't done any study, then how do we know some of the pollutants come from outside Hong Kong and not produced locally? The SO2 and NOx might be produced locally. Is it because of that they feel they don't have to do any study, or is it that there are certain difficulties in doing the studies, Mr. Mok? Thank you, Chairman. In our several air pollutants, now, if we say there's SO2 and NOx in our atmosphere, now this is mainly our own, from our own emission. So we didn't study how much of it is from abroad. But there are two pollutants which are more regional, and as I said, these are the particulates and ozone. Now, these two are regional air pollutants. Now, for particulate matters, for PM, if the mainland emits sulfur dioxide or NOx, when they come to Hong Kong, they become sulfates and nitrates. They become particulates. So that's why we focus on particulates and ozone. Now, for particulate matters, now in the audit report, it's been said that universities did studies and we did commission universities. Now, as for ozone, recently the PolyU completed a study on ozone, and the findings show also that the growth in ozone in Hong Kong is due to regional factors to a large extent, and this has to do with the chemical process, because the ozone was generated and then VOC is produced, and then it will be blown to Hong Kong and they become transformed into ozone. So that's the scientific basis. Leung Sing. I will be brief. Now, according to Para 6.7, the EPD announced that Hong Kong achieved the joint declaration of 2002 about the 2010 targets. Now, this merits our congratulations. We have also to look at 6.3c. The two governments aim to strive to reduce the emissions from their own sources by the same levels in 2010. Now, we start from different levels, but we share the same goals. Now, is it unfair to one side or the other, or is it easier to the other? Now, if we apply the same standards or measuring sticks, measures, now, was it unfair or was it too lenient for Hong Kong at the time such levels were decided upon? Now, and have Guangdong achieved the goals, and what's the difference compared with us? Now, in 2002, we came up with these targets on the 4 pollutants in 2002, and as Mr. Ng said, now we use the same objectives, that is, we use 1997 as basis, and we reduce 20 to 50% for each pollutant. So we use the same targets. So indeed, it may not fully reflect the local situation.
From
the viewpoint of Hong Kong, we have fewer factories and fewer industries. So in terms of VOC and other pollutants, we've been able to not just attain the targets, but exceeded the targets. In the PRD region, of the 4 pollutants, sulfur dioxide, NOx, and RSPs, they attained their targets. But for VOCs, the emission target was to reduce the pollution by 55% when compared with the 1995 level. But eventually, they only got a reduction of 20%. Hong Kong, after all, is a more mature city, and in Guangdong province, they're talking about a GDP growth of over 100%. In the past few decades. So for 2015 and 2020, we have learned from our experience. And in accordance with our economic developments and emission circumstances, should we set our respective targets? So we still focus on the 4 pollutants. But for Hong Kong and Guangdong, in accordance with the actual circumstances and emission targets, we would set our own objectives. On the 23rd of November, we released a paper to the panel, and we can reissue it later. Well, for the 2 sides, there are these cross-boundary vehicles. Earlier, the CE suspended the individual visit scheme for vehicles because some organizations have expressed their worry. Now, different vehicles use different fuel at the moment. Some vehicles use cheaper fuel. So do we have a consistent standard? I'm not talking about marine vessels, but cross-boundary vehicles. Mr. Mok. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Concerning fuel used by vehicles, first of all, in the past few years, on the mainland, they have expedited their improvement program on the use of fuel. And in certain regions on the mainland, they have already got improved petrol. On the mainland, they abolished their road tax and changed it to fuel tax. You'll recall that in Hong Kong, for vehicular fuel, we no longer impose a diesel tax. So on the one side, we have tax reduction. On the other side, we have tax increases. So on the mainland, quality assurance is not so good for fuel. I understand that some vehicles had to come back to Hong Kong and be repaired. So many vehicles are more inclined to fill their tanks in Hong Kong. Final question. The Guangdong government and the Hong Kong government will set ultimate emission standards. Now it's 2012, almost 2013. What about the new targets, new objectives? When would they be formulated? Will there be annual reviews, annual inspections, or phased reviews? Together with the Guangdong province, just on the 23rd of November, we announced a new set of objectives. One set for 2015, one set for 2020. For 2015, we already have concrete measures to implement the targets. And 2020 will fall within the 13th five-year plan of the mainland. Take SO2 as an example. The Guangdong target is to reduce 20 to 35%. But specifically, to what extent will they reduce the emission of SO2? It really depends on their latest assessment. Kenneth, would you like to wrap up the issues? Well, to be brief, I'd like to thank the administration for coming here to present us with so many details. As for the outstanding details, we would like to have them as early as possible. Tomorrow we'll have an internal meeting. For members to evaluate the information we received in this exercise. Well, that's something internal. So thank you, the two bureau directors, the permanent secretaries, in particular Andrew, Mr. MOK and Mr. Pang, for their detailed explanation of complex issues. Thank you very much.